Our Arkansas Global Changemakers Initiative is a collaboration between the Social Innovation Initiative of the Walton College of Business and the International and Global Studies programs of the Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences. Through an innovative list of courses, study abroad initiatives, research, extracurricular opportunities, as well as community engagement events, such as this one, we foster social capital formation and directly engage in the consolidation of the social business movement in our region. So we are inspired by a motto, learning globally to act locally. So this initiative really aims to bring communities together, enhancing collaboration around the development of local solutions to pressing social challenges. At Arkansas Global Changemakers, we believe there is much to be learned from the experience and success of social innovation initiatives and transformative initiatives in other parts of the world, and the process through which these initiatives can inform local efforts to tackle similar problems. So the Fulbright Scholars Social Impact Series is an effort to bring the knowledge and experience of distinguished Fulbright scholars currently pursuing a degree at the University of Arkansas, with our efforts to tackle some of the most pressing social and environmental challenges affecting our communities. So by inviting Fulbright scholars to connect social challenges with the way in which these challenges manifest in their country of origin, we learn from the differences and similarities in the ways they conceive of these problems and the strategies they use to overcome these problems. So we do this with the intention to foster dialogue, collaboration, mutual understanding, and also fostering the opportunity to learn from the solutions, the innovations, and the strategies developed around the world. So we believe this could be a great opportunity to inspire Fulbright scholars to become the leaders of this transformation we want to see in the world. And by building and establishing a solid network of global change makers across all continents and areas of expertise, we aim this to be just the seed that will take us there. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Christian, for organizing this first event.
Good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you this morning to discuss this important topic. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker this morning, and that is Dr. Adrienne Milner. She is currently a senior lecturer at Brunel University in London. She holds a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Miami and has over 10 years of teaching experience at both US and UK universities. Her research examines racial attitudes, policy preferences, and health outcomes with an emphasis on police brutality, the Affordable Care Act, and COVID-19. I've also been lucky enough to have Dr. Milner as one of my lecturers when I studied in London. So I will now hand over to you. Thank you, Adrienne.
Thank you so much, Krish. I'm just going to share my slides and hopefully everyone can see them here. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, perfect. So thank you so much to the Fulbright Scholar Social Impact Series for having me, and to the University of Arkansas. I'm really excited to be here today to be speaking to you about international perspectives on global policing using examples from the US and the UK. And I really look forward to hearing your questions and having a discussion after the talks. So Olga, we have a poll just to get things going for everyone. So if everyone wants to participate in the poll, we shouldn't be able to see your responses geared to your name, so they will be anonymous.
Yes, they will be anonymous. Mm-hmm. I can put it on.
Okay, great. So the first question is, in the past several months, how would you describe how much issues of racism and policing have been on your mind? The second question is, in the past year, how would you describe how much issues of racism and policing have been on your mind? And how familiar are you with the term colorblind racism? So if you can just click those questions, and again, we won't know what you say, but we'll be able to collate the responses once everyone has a chance to answer those. So we're seeing some interesting results here for the first question in terms of the past several months, where only less than 10% feel that they've been thinking about these things all the time, but still people thinking about them a lot. And where we have for the second question, we see, again, people thinking about these things a lot. And we have a mix here about how people are familiar with the term colorblind racism. So no worries if you're part of that half of the group that isn't familiar, because we will be going through it all in this presentation. So I wanted to compare the data with what we just got in your responses in terms of national data with Americans' feelings towards the Black Lives Matter movement since June versus September. And obviously now we would probably see even more of a drop off of people supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. So on the left here, you can see white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian adults' support for the Black Lives Matter movement and the differences between June and September. And we see about a 25% drop off of white people's support for the Black Lives Matter movement, where we still have really strong support maintained for Black Americans. At the bottom left, you can see there's a huge split between Democrats and Republicans, with Democrats much more likely to support the Black Lives Matter movement than Republicans. And on the right, the graph shows the difference between strongly supporting the Black Lives Matter movement versus somewhat supporting the movement, where again, you see huge racial differences here between Black and white adults, and a bit smaller differences between Hispanic and Asian and Black adults. But we see at the bottom here, again, only 2% of white Republicans supporting strongly the Black Lives Matter movement. So how can we make sense of this data? And we can use racial theory to do this. So the first part of my talk, as we start out, I want to mention why I'm the one speaking about this today. And the first reason is that for the past year, and we've just come up on the year anniversary on Ahmaud Arbery's unfortunate death, for this past year, scholars of color, and specifically Black scholars, have been bombarded with requests to speak about racism, policing, diversity, and equality, even when it's not even their area of research. And as excited I am to be at this event, and as impressed as I am with the Fulbright Scholars Program, unfortunately, speaking at these events and giving people's time and emotional labor does not really progress our careers. In terms of academia, publications, grants, teaching, those sorts of things are what we're judged on in those metrics. And when people are giving their time, and specifically scholars of color are asked to give their time and emotional labor and not getting anything returned, that's really problematic. So the second reason why I'm speaking today is, as a white person, I have privilege. I don't get in trouble when I speak about these matters. I don't get attacked. This doesn't damage my career if I'm saying things that are controversial or sensitive. So I just wanted to address that, and again, I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. So back to the talk, I wanted to mention how most Americans think, and most people in the UK as well, think that when we say the word racism, we're talking about old-fashioned biological racism. So this would be the notion that Black people are biologically inferior to white people. And that's no longer acceptable, and that kind of went out of fashion in the 60s, and it's not socially desirable to say old-fashioned racist sentiments. Those changed to more cultural racism sentiments. So things like, yeah, I know that people are the same, but Black people just tend not to care as much about education as white people, or Black people are just more prone to violence. And again, this became socially unacceptable in the past couple of decades. So now we have the new racism. So this is colorblind racism. This is the idea that I don't see color. Please do not talk to me about race. I am a good person, I judge everyone equally. But this is really problematic too, because Megan Burke gives the definition that colorblind racism is a defense of the status quo, a defense of individuals who may sincerely believe that they operate without bias, an assertion of equal opportunity that minimizes the reality of racism in favor of individual or cultural explanations for inequality. And when we talk about policing, we can really apply how this framework fits, and we'll do that later in the talk. So in order to combat problems in policing and other problems like we've seen in COVID-19 in terms of racial health disparities, we need to move from a notion of non-racist, I'm not racist, to I'm anti-racist, and I'm actively practicing anti-racism. And this is not something that, oh, I go to a Black Lives Matter protest, I get my anti-racism badge. No, this is something that's a lifelong commitment. And this is especially important for white people because they hold the majority of political, economic, and social power in the US. I wanted to give a different, an overview of different types of racism using social theory, just in case people aren't as familiar. But again, we're going to be focusing on the last kind of 4 types of racism because old-fashioned racism has declined in the 1960s. So institutional racism, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard the word systemic racism, is a macro-level covert institutional justification to maintain white social dominance. So we can measure this by asking people, how do you feel about Black people's current level of political power in the US? And people say, it's fine. They don't say Black people should have more power, and especially white people. They just say, it's fine. And when we realize that Black people are highly underrepresented in terms of political power. Symbolic racism is a social psychological theory, and this is the belief that Black people violate traditional American values. It's not based on self-interest, where laissez-faire racism is based on self-interest, and it's a more socio-historical economic theory. So this is the belief that Black people oftentimes do not have the skills to be in leadership position in companies and in universities and so forth. And again, the last kind of focus of our talk today is colorblind racism. And this is the idea that people do not see color and that we live in a meritocracy. This also encompasses notions of racial apathy. So it's, please don't talk to me about race. So when you ask Americans specifically, if you ask them, how do you feel about abortion? They'll tell you, I support abortion, I do not support abortion. If you ask them about gay marriage, they will say, I support gay marriage, I do not say I support gay marriage. If you ask Americans how they feel about affirmative action, they will say, please do not speak to me about this. I don't support it, I don't not support it, I don't want to talk about it. And when I say, and this is mainly white Americans. So I wanted to give a demographic profile of who is adopting these racist attitudes in the US, and this can really help us understand people's feelings towards police violence and brutality. So we see about 25% of Americans hold more old-fashioned racist attitudes than anti-racist attitudes. So about a quarter of Americans, and this data is nationally representative data from the American National Election Studies from 2016. Over half of Americans hold these are white Americans, I'm sorry, hold institutional racist attitudes. 67.9%, so almost 70% hold symbolic racist attitudes, 63% laissez-faire racist attitudes, and 64% colorblind racist attitudes. So taken together, those last 4 categories, it's almost astonishing how more racist white Americans are than anti-racist. And this lets us understand issues that continue to persist, like police brutality. I wanted to show you here, though, about data specifically from the police in the US. So you can see here that white police officers are more than double as likely to hold explicit racial bias attitudes. And even you can see here that Black officers are less likely to be racist than white officers, but they're still not as anti-racist as their Black and Latinx counterparts. So you can see across all of these metrics here that we have more anti-racist attitudes than anti-racist attitudes among police is reflected towards the general population. And this is a big problem, obviously. So thinking about colorblind racism. Some of you may be asking yourself, why is this a problem? I've been taught that this is what I'm supposed to do, that I'm supposed to not see color. I'm supposed to treat everybody equally. And when you think about police brutality, you can have these notions that we grew up in this colorblind framework. How can we combat police brutality if we live in a guise of colorblindness? So firstly, why this notion fails is that we've all been taught to immediately see race. So when we meet someone, we try to analyze their race. And maybe there's people in the audience right now who are racially ambiguous and they're constantly asked, where are you from? And you're like, well, I'm from Fayetteville. And they're like, no, really, where are you from, right? So we see people's race. If we can't clock their race, if we can't clock their sex, we can't clock their socioeconomic status, people tend to get uncomfortable. The second reason why colorblind racism fails is that it erases historical and persistent racism. In terms of police brutality, notions of colorblindness stop us from correcting our historical mistakes. And thirdly, colorblind racism impedes racial progress and does not provide a framework for understanding nor addressing racism. So again, we might not have heard the word colorblind racism, but besides I don't see color, we've heard we're all the same on the inside. You know, I have a child friend partner of color, so I'm not racist. And again, this really fails because I'm sure some of you know men who are in relationships with women who are still sexist. So people shouldn't be given an opportunity or not based on their race. Or why is it always about race? Race won't go away because we keep talking about it, or we're all in this together. And I get this a lot when we talk about racism, and especially this past year, talking about police brutality. It's that I'm the problem because I'm talking about racism. I'm the one who's a segregationist and I'm being divisive. So I wanted to turn to how we could apply this colorblind racist framework to police brutality in the UK. So maybe if we look at the UK, we can think about our own framework for colorblind racism and understanding police brutality in the US. So in the UK, what I've heard a lot in London is that George Floyd's murder was a wake-up call, okay? And again, this is something that happens in the US. It's just not as bad here. That's what people say in the UK. But this is colorblind racism because it ignores the terror people feel. And I have a lot of Black students who said, I'm scared to go on the tube. I'm scared to walk at night because I'm so worried about police violence, right? So it ignores the lived realities of people, and it also ignores that there have been deaths in police custody. And these are some examples that I've listed here. So in England and Wales, 93% of police officers are white and only 1.3% are Black. So this is 84.8% of the population versus 3.6% of the population. So we have a huge underrepresentation of Black police officers in the UK. And we can see how this is a problem and people aren't talking about it. Black people are 8 times more likely than white people to be stopped and searched by police in the UK. So this is 37 white people stopped and searched for every 10,000 residents compared to 315 Black residents. Police are 5 times more likely to use force against Black people than white people, 11 times more likely to use firearms, 8 times more likely to use batons, and 6 times more likely to use handcuffs. And Black people are twice as likely as people to be detained under the Mental Health Act that we have here. So this is the idea, especially if someone's seen to be schizophrenic or having a mental break or having an episode that is psychotic, they are more likely to be detained than white people. And Black people are nearly twice as likely as white people to die, either immediately or during contact with police. So you can see how this notion that we're all the same or that we should all treat people the same isn't what's actually happening in reality in the UK, and it maintains the status quo that enables police brutality to continue when people say, it's not a problem here, it's in the US. So in conclusion, I wanted to highlight that colorblind racist ideology maintains the current racial hierarchy, and this contributes to how police brutality continues to occur over and over and over again, even a year after Ahmaud Arbery's death, and we're coming up to the George Floyd anniversary at the end of May. Continuous action-oriented anti-racism is necessary to address racial inequality. So we can't just go to one talk or go to one protest. This is something that is a lifelong commitment to reversing racist historical action. And lastly, I know some of this is a bit negative, but I wanted to say that public attention towards police brutality provides an opportunity to move towards a more anti-racist society in the US and globally. So because of the pandemic, people had the opportunity to think, to learn, to engage with what's going on in the US and to reflect on these issues. And I do think that people are more aware of police brutality, and because of that, we can make a change. So thank you so much for listening, and I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you for that insightful talk and for that explanation on colorblind racism and how it links to systemic social problems such as police brutality. Adrienne, just a quick question from the audience is, how do you define white American for the statistics that you presented?
With this is self-identification. So this is people self-identifying as white in the ANES data.
Great, thank you very much. It is now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker for this morning. I would like to introduce Gareth Newham. He has spent over 2 decades working to improve policing and public safety in my home country, South Africa. He currently heads the Justice and Violence Prevention Program at the Institute for Security Studies, or ISS. ISS is an independent African authority on research, policy, and training organizations working to enhance human security in South Africa. So Gareth will give us a snapshot of police brutality in South Africa and some other parts of Africa. Over to you, Gareth.
There we go. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the seminar this morning. And yes, this is a very topical issue, and it's a big issue. Certainly policing and police brutality is an issue in South Africa. So I'm going to speak a little more about the kind of work that we do. As you mentioned, we do policy-oriented research, we do technical assistance, and we do capacity building. Organization that I work for looks at human security across Africa. We have offices in Senegal, in Ethiopia, Kenya, and our head offices in Pretoria in South Africa, where I'm based. And I'm going to speak to you a bit today about policing in South Africa and talk about some of the issues around race and brutality and some of the key challenges facing policing at the moment, and look at some trends. So overall, I'll be just giving a bit of a brief historical context, looking at the issue of racial inequality in South Africa, police reform post-democracy, looking at some recent policing performance and officer conduct, and then I'll conclude. And I'll speak for about 20 minutes or so. So, just a historical context, although there's evidence of modern humans living in South Africa for about 170,000 years, South Africa has a history of colonization, with the Dutch settlers, the Dutch first colonizing South Africa in 1652. That led to wars. Well, there was basically then we were then colonized by England. There was a Boer War at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, and later we became a republic. And from 1948 onwards, we had a system called Apartheid, which separated people based on their skin color, and they came up with 4 key categories, namely white, black, colored, and Asian or Indian. And the police during apartheid were largely seen as quite brutal. There was something called the security branch within the South African police force during the time, which was responsible for basically political policing. In other words, ensuring or trying to not only enforce apartheid laws, which segregated people, but also target those that were fighting against apartheid, particularly those that belonged to what were seen as the liberation movements. Then in 1994, following a negotiated settlement, we had democracy for the first time, and Nelson Mandela was our first president. So we come from a history of brutality, where basically control of the population and the state's ability to control the population was largely based on violence, brutality, and for most of our history, very discriminatory and exclusionary. It was meant to really support white people at the expense of other groups. And the colored and Indian groups largely arrived in South Africa as slaves, and obviously the black groups were indigenous to South Africa before colonialization arrived. To give you a bit of a sense of our demography at the time of democracy and now, on the left-hand side, you'll see in 1990, we had about a total of 23 million people, of which 65% were black, just under 20% were white, 12% were colored, and 3.5% were Asian. The last census that we did was in 2011, and then a total of 51.4 million people, of which just under 80% were black, just under 9% white, similar numbers for those called colored, which is a sort of term that's been used there, and then Asian, 2.5%. So we are quite a diverse country, but the racial issues are also then further broken down into ethnicity. So we have 11 different official languages and ethnic groups. Those identified as isiZulu are the largest group. About 22 to 23% speak that as a home language, followed by isiXhosa, Afrikaans, and English. So those are the kind of four main languages, although most people do speak English in South Africa. White South Africans, about 60% speak Afrikaans as a home language, and about 40% speak English or another language. And currently our population is around 60 million. So that just gives you a sense of the racial and demographic breakdown of South Africa. We're a very unequal country. In fact, on the Gini coefficient, we're one of the most unequal countries on the planet. This slide will just give you a breakdown by race and unemployment and poverty. So you can see that although unemployment has dropped since 1994 for Black African people, it's still very high. The most recent statistics we released this week showing that about 32% of South Africans are out of work. And that is mostly Black South Africans. Colored South Africans are around 21% unemployed, Indians 12%, and white are around 7% unemployment. So you can see the massive disparity between being white and being Black in South Africa. And then that leads to poverty. So you can see that when you look at the poverty line, people living on less than $66 per month in 2017, 64% of those people who are poor, that level are Black African people, 41% colored, just under 6% Asian, only 1% white. So you can see senior white. So 95% of the commanders in the police at that point were white. These pictures just show you some of the police badge and just what police officers typically wear and look like in South African society. So after really a big effort to try and amalgamate what we call the Homeland Police Forces with the South African Police Force into a new democratic policing agency, that now looks very different to what it was then. So the next slide will just give you a sense of the racial profile of the South African Police Service. So in total, it is quite representative. So about 9% of all police personnel are white, and around 77% of police personnel are Black. Colored people are overrepresented. They're about, as you saw earlier, just under 9% of the population, but about 11% of the police service. Interestingly enough, if you still look at the rank structure, you'll find that non-commissioned officers, in other words, people of below the rank of captain, in other words, they're not really in supervisory positions, only 6% are white, whereas in middle management positions, 22% are white, and at senior manager level, 17% are white. So still today, white people are still well overrepresented in the management structures of the South African Police Service. Now, although there's been a lot of improvement, and you can't compare the South African Police Service today with what was going on in apartheid, there still have been big challenges to do with police brutality in South Africa. Between 300 and 400 people are killed by police every year in South Africa, mostly in policing when they are trying to investigate crimes or they come across the scene of a crime and a shootout occurs. We have a lot of weapons. I'm not saying that these shootings or killings are necessarily unlawful. We are a very violent society. We have one of the highest murder rates in the world. About 58 people die every day on average, and our murder rate is around 36, 37 murders per 100,000 people, which is about 6 times higher than the international or global average of 6 murders per 100,000 people. So certainly we are a very violent country, and that has to do with a very violent past, and the structural racism, structural reasons that lead to violence continue today, particularly around inequality. So there's definitely an association and link between high inequality levels and levels of violence. And this is true for a number of different countries, middle income countries like South Africa, Brazil being another example, for example. However, there are too many incidents where people are brutalized by the police. So there was a study done last year that looked at the number of formal complaints opened with the Independent Police Investigative Directorate. Structures were set up to try and promote police accountability. And there were about 42,000 complaints over the last 7 years, formal complaints. And we also know that, however, most people who are victims of police brutality do not complain about the police. They do feel scared to go towards the police station. And there have been about 6 different inquiries looking at racism in the South African Police Service. Not many recently, but mostly in the first 10 years. There would be incidents and there'd be an inquiry. And they would typically find that certain racial attitudes still persisted. And different race groups tend to still feel that they were victimized in the South African Police Service. If you're a white police officer, you're probably likely to think that you're not receiving fair promotions and fair opportunities of moving up the ranks, despite what I mentioned earlier, that the senior ranks are still overrepresented by white people. And if you're black, you probably feel the same way, but you also feel that you're not given enough resources or enough support, expect to do dangerous, difficult work. There's not really much hard evidence or the hard research going into policing to the extent we would like it in South Africa. So we don't have the kind of data to find out what are police racial attitudes at the moment, for example. Or is there a difference in policing in predominantly black areas versus white areas? There does seem to be a difference in from ethnographic studies that look at policing in different areas that is more to do with basically wealth or class. So in many police precincts, there'll be a combination of very poor areas, informal settlements, very poor people live in wealthier houses, wealthier areas, and the police tend to be more deferent and a bit more polite in the wealthy areas and tend to be more brutal and harsh in poorer areas. And you'll probably find that the reason for that is that wealthy people can afford lawyers and can make their voices heard, lay complaints, whereas in too often poorer areas, poor people, mostly who are black, as you know from the previous slides, would not feel comfortable opening cases or trying to complain against police officials. So a lot of these issues continue. In the last, say, decade or so, from around 2009, we've had a situation which has been termed broadly as state capture. So at the highest level, our president has been accused of working to repurpose state institutions for his personal benefit and those who are loyal to him. And that has had a terrible impact on our overall criminal justice system. Because what was the way this was done is that our constitution, when it was drafted, gave an immense amount of power to the president to make direct appointments. So, for example, not only is the Minister of Police appointed by our president, but so is the National Commissioner, the Chief of Police. And going back to basically the second president, Thabo Mbeki, appointed our first black National Commissioner of Police. His name was Jackie Selebi, and he had not been a police officer. He was largely appointed because he was of his personal and political loyalties to the then president. And for 17 years, up until 2017, South Africa did not have a trained police official as a national commissioner. And it's a very hierarchical structure, the police in South Africa. It's quite paramilitary. So it has been a bit of a problem to have the most powerful person just be sort of parachuted into the top of the organization without having the necessary training, police experience, expertise, or integrity in some cases. Jackie Selebi was eventually convicted and jailed for corruption. And since then, that happened in around 2010, we've had about 6 different people occupying the post of national commissioners, 4 of which were implicated in corruption and removed. And currently, even our current national commissioner, who's actually a police officer, has some clouds hanging over his head. So this situation was particularly bad, as I mentioned, during the former president, Jacob Zuma was his name, between 2009 and 2018. And because he was appointing people into the police who were there, who primarily saw their position is there to serve his personal and political agenda, and they would start appointing people around them who they thought they could control. This has had quite severe negative impact on both the performance and officer conduct and the systems in place to try and address that. So I'll show you some slides that just demonstrate this. There you'll see that the police budget between 2012 and as of currently date has gone up by about 60%. It's now standing at almost 102 billion rand, which in dollar terms is about $7 billion US. And there's been an above inflationary increase for the police every year. As you know, we've got about 187,000 people in the police. This slide just kind of shows that the focus has been on visible policing. So that blue line going up the top there is the program called Visible Policing. That's for the people wearing police uniforms who drive around in marked cars. And the general approach to policing in South Africa has been one of let's have more police and hopefully that will reduce our crime rate. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. It's what the police do and how they use their expertise and functions that makes more of a difference. And as you can see further down on the sort of yellow, just below the red graph, that's your investigative capacity, that's your detective services. And you can see that the expenditure on that has been far lower and not, although it's been increasing slowly, it's not increased nearly as much as visible policing. And then below that, you'll see the blue and purple lines. That's our, the blue line is intelligence, crime intelligence, which is the ability of the police to identify criminal networks. And that has also not grown very much. So the consequence for policing has been, and that shows the arrest rates. The police make, at 2014, they made 1.8 million arrests in that year, and that has dropped quite considerably. It's about a 24% drop. The bottom red part shows you arrests for violent crimes, which has also been declining. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Most of the people who are being arrested are poor young black men in the streets, and most of the experience of the police has been very negative because there's a systemic and endemic problem of police brutality. Because our criminal justice system is very weak, very low chance of being criminally prosecuted and convicted, a lot of the police, in order to establish authority and in their minds to sometimes assert the rule of law, they break the law by using unnecessary force, and which leads to a high level of fear of the police and brutality. If you go down here, we can just see this detection rate means the ability of the police to solve murder has declined quite dramatically since around 2012. When it was about 30%, it's now standing around 20%. So quite a big drop in that ability to solve murder. This is for armed robberies. You can see again from 2012, a big decline. The reason why there were improvements up until around 2010, 2012 is because we had the FIFA World Cup soccer in South Africa, which led to huge injection of funding into the police, great partnerships internationally and locally, and a sense of the country coming together. But from 2012 onwards, we've seen a different story. That just shows you disciplinary hearing trends, and you can see in the last 3 years, there's been a massive reduction in disciplinary hearings for police officers where there's been allegations of wrongdoing. So people no longer actually really report these cases. They go to the courts and try and get damages. This slide shows you the amount that the police have paid out to the victims of unlawful police behavior that has been proven in court. And in the last 5 years or so, it's 1.8 billion rand, which is about $128 million. So that has been a big problem because poor police conduct, often brutality, unlawful arrest, is now driving a budgetary challenge there. And that just shows that with that, you've seen a decline in the public approval of police dropping from 64% to about 54%. So yeah, not so much about race. As I say, we haven't got the kind of levels of racial research into South Africa, but we do have a challenge there. There's certainly every now and then are instances of race. It's still a big political issue. Certainly some political parties use race as a way to try and mobilize their supporters and in order to try and make racially inflammatory statements. So it's very much a topic in South Africa, but the reality still is that most South Africans would recognize the need to work together, that there's a need for all races in South Africa, and very high proportions are willing to try and work to get beyond racism. But I think South Africa has a long way still to go. And as was being mentioned earlier by Adrienne, a lot of people don't really think very much about race. They stay in their own kind of clusters and groups and bubbles and don't really speak about it. And there might be these incidents that happen in the media every now and then that everybody speaks about, but I think there's a lot of work that really gets to be done to get down to the root cause, which I understand, structural racism, and to get away from the colorblind racism, because a lot of, certainly white people in South Africa say, I'm not racist. Some of my best friends are black, but then would say something racist at another point. Anyway, I'll end there, and I think I'll be guided by your questions and interests. So thank you very much again for inviting me to the seminar.
Thank you for that insightful talk, Gareth, and just for painting the picture currently of what we're experiencing in South Africa. So I would like to encourage the audience members to send in any questions that you have for the panelists. I will get us started, and Adrienne, I'm going to direct this question at you. How do we measure the level of racism in the community? So what are the variables or metrics, and how are they tracked?
Okay, so how we measured racism on those different concepts of colorblind racism or symbolic racism, there's been valid and reliable scales that are used. So we use Sears and Henry scale of systemic racism from which contains questions such as how much do you agree or disagree with the following sentiments? And there would be questions such as Italians, Jews, and Irish people have worked their way up without any special favors. Black people should do the same. How much do you agree or disagree with that sentiment? That would be a symbolic racism question. Again, I mentioned a systemic racism question would be a metric along the lines of white people have too much political power. Do you agree or disagree? How strongly? And you would ask that for all sorts of people, depending on race. You could even ask questions that are race proxies, like how much political power Muslim people have. So every one of those different types of metrics has a valid and reliable sort of scale. For colorblind racism, we would measure apathy. So how much people don't care or they do care about racial issues. And again, those old-fashioned measurements would be if people feel warm or cold towards people of different races, if they believe that people are more intelligent or hardworking, all of those things can be related to race. And when we do the data analysis, we would also make sure that we would use factor analysis and other sorts of statistical techniques to make sure that those constructs are measuring what we actually want them to be doing.
Absolutely. Thanks for that answer. I would like to steer the discussion in the direction of health and health outcomes. I think we can all acknowledge, the severe outcomes of police brutality. So, for instance, ending in death, injury, and so forth. But I wanted to talk about other health outcomes as well. I think, Gareth, you alluded to this, that in South Africa, there are protective effects that you get from being white. So, in the health world, we're always thinking in terms of protective effects or risk factors. So could you speak a little bit more about that in terms of if you're white in South Africa, how actually you're shielded from many of the negative outcomes that a Black person might experience?
Yeah, in many ways. I mean, I just gave two examples of employment and poverty. And of course, if you're wealthy, then you can afford medical aid. So more white South Africans are more likely to have private medical aid and better healthcare. Will have longer lifespans, lower child mortality rates, is immediate examples of sort of where whites are privileged compared to, say, Black South Africans. And then when it comes to kind of the policing issues, white people are more or less likely, it doesn't never happen, but less likely to be a victim of police brutality than Black people. So generally, when you look at the kind of victims, it's where there are official reports, there's 42,000 cases, it's generally Black people who are, Black males particularly, that are being victimized by the police or likely to be on the receiving end of police brutality. And then also with crime, if you look at the sort of murder distribution, it's in some, although I'd say the average murder rate per 100,000 is 30 murders per 100,000. In some poorer Black townships, it's up to 200 to 300 murders per 100,000, and specifically amongst young Black males. And again, the murder rate amongst white males and white people is much lower. It's about half the sort of average murder rate in South Africa for other races. So certainly, the benefits that the white population received under apartheid haven't changed much. It's not that there haven't been a range of interventions. There's been affirmative action. There's been Black economic empowerment legislation and policies and so forth. But still today, I mean, I would say most of the top management in most businesses, the private sector, are run by white males. As I already pointed out, in the public sector, although most people working in the public sector be Black, white people will be overrepresented in the management positions, which earn higher salaries. So it's definitely, I mean, there's a lot that still needs to be done before we can say that we've achieved anything close to what would be an equal society or a society that was fair and just.
And Adrienne, could you kind of speak a little bit to that topic in terms of protective effects if we're looking at the UK and the US context?
Yeah, so I think the most relevant example is obviously COVID-19, because oftentimes we're saying there are disparities or that racially minoritized people have worse outcomes, but no one's saying white people are benefiting from being white. They're protected in terms of COVID-19. There's an advantage for white people, both in terms of cases and ill effects like death and so forth. So that the constructs that I gave with the measures of how many people adopt those racist attitudes is actually from a paper dealing with COVID-19. So in the UK, this is something people are really finally kind of considering, even though we see detrimental health effects for racially minoritized people. It's the same in the UK in terms of Black maternal health outcomes, where we see really high rates of death for Black women compared to white women who are giving birth. So COVID-19 has kind of highlighted that it's not just maybe about disadvantage, but it's also about privilege. And in terms of police brutality, specifically in terms of health outcomes, it doesn't even have to be if you're a victim of the police. So Abigail Sewell out of Emory University, she has some really great research showing that if you're in an area where police brutality happens, you have worse health outcomes, even if you're not the victim, even if you do not witness the police brutality. If you're a minoritized person, because of stress effects, psychological effects, and it creates this weathering effect over time, where just being in the vicinity with more police brutality, and if Garrett says it's the same in the US, where it's not just sometimes highly segregated racially minoritized communities, but also poorer communities, you have worse health by living in those communities. And this is exacerbated by police, not just brutality, but things like stop and frisk, police presence, and so on and so forth.
Great, thank you for that. We've had another audience question, and Adrienne, I'll start with you again here. How do we talk to people who deny that racism exists? So I think for many of us, especially in the academic world, we see these statistics, we see the impacts of racism, either directly or indirectly. But when we're, having a chat with somebody, how do we explain this, and how do we actually convince them that something like colorblind racism is alive and well in 2021?
Yeah, I think I get this a lot, from students, and they say, when we speak about it in class, it makes sense. But then I go home and I talk to my roommate, and I can't remember what to say, or I try to talk to my family members and I don't know what to say. So I think the first thing in order to disarm someone is to ask questions. So why do you think this? Or, well, the data says this. How do you negotiate that? I mean, that's the first thing, is trying to understand where they're coming from. And the second thing is to speak their language. So if you're talking about academics or scholars specifically, and you're talking to biologists, show them studies that are done by biologists that show that their racism causes disparities, not genetics. Right? So this is postcodes, not genetic codes, like those sorts of things, right? So show them studies that have been done by people in their field. So there's some great sociologists who have actually gone and got their PhDs in biology or genetics, so they could talk to people about race. There's also even people like neurologists who've gotten their PhDs in sociology, so that they could show that there's no sex effects in terms of brain differences or whatever it is. So I think speaking their language, showing data. However, it's really interesting in the US, because there's an effect where oftentimes you show people data, and it's been empirically proven that sometimes they double down on their incorrectness. So when you show people data that contradicts with their beliefs, oftentimes they experience almost a fight or flight response. And they go the opposite direction, even if they're wrong. So I think that's something in the US that we really need to combat, is anti-science and anti-data, anti-evidence. And I think you can do that by starting out with trying to understand where they're coming from to begin with, and then go from there. So I think it's important as well to recognize that you can present all the evidence in the world, and that's data in itself, that, look, I'm presenting you evidence and you're refuting it. This is what racism is.
Absolutely. And in the South African context, Gareth, as you mentioned, Black people make up the majority of the population. So even though we can speak about history and we can speak about apartheid and so forth, there are many people who are not willing to have that discussion because they feel as though we keep going back to the past, or we want to make everything about racism. How would you combat those comments?
Yeah, again, it's the same kinds of challenges I think that Adrienne were talking about. I think it's mostly people don't necessarily mix as much as they would across races. So you'll probably find that although white people would say that they've had more engagement with Black people than Black people who would say they've had engagement with white people, because there's so relatively few white people, and if you're talking to people in, say, rural areas, they would Black people living there would hardly ever see white people. But it's mostly, and also it seems to be mostly linked to employment. So people might be working, if you're employed, you're likely to come across and engage with other people from different races. But still, people don't really socialize with different racial groups as much as that should happen. I think in South Africa, the situation is because there was a big shift in political power in 1994, there's this idea amongst white people they've lost power. And now there's a strong sense of victimization. There's an idea that commonly expressed that affirmative action is unfair to white people, and white people aren't getting jobs that they would otherwise get because jobs are being reserved for Black people. And those are strongly held beliefs, but and as I showed data showing that that's not actually happening. I mean, again, it's a very difficult issue because the reality simply is that white people do hold most of the economic power still in South Africa. The various initiatives and state policies that are trying to address apartheid and racial segregatory inequality haven't really worked to the extent that they should have, and that's all to do with poor implementation of economic policy. We actually had what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that lasted for 4 years early on in democracy, but it was really just looking at human rights, and it didn't actually deal with the issue of race at all. It just really kind of almost ignored race completely and thought the issue was about, were you a victim of human rights, gross human rights violations, rather than how are you going to deal with a very segregated and racialized society. So I think you'll find that you would still find very few South Africans, white South Africans, I'm talking about, that say they supported apartheid. They will say, no, we didn't support apartheid. There are still those that say that apartheid is better that apartheid was better than democracy. And interestingly enough, you still have Black South Africans, particularly older, much older Black South Africans, that sometimes say these things. And that's largely because of that sort of retrospective amnesia, where you think back to your youth and you were better, you're younger, stronger, and things were great. And then you think, well, it must have to do something with the system because this current system is not working for me. But yeah, I think what really typically happens is that people tend to hang out with like-minded people. So if you are aware of race, you don't like racism, you're anti-race, you're anti-racist activist, you're going to generally hang out with people like that, and you're not really going to come across people who are racist. And the other way around is, of course, if you do hold strongly racist views, you're probably not going to hang out with people who are not racist. So and it is quite a sensitive topic. So people generally don't openly speak about their racial beliefs. They will only sort of speak about it in closed groups.
There we go. So many would argue that, we tend to rely on the police to solve problems that actually require different professionals with different skill sets, such as mental health professionals, who would be better placed to apply their expertise as opposed to viewing these problems through the lens of the criminal justice system. So would you agree on this? And do you think that this, represents somewhere we could be moving towards in the future? And I'll start with you, Adrienne.
Yeah, so I completely agree with this. And it's come up when I've given similar talks, the question of defunding the police. Okay. And white people hate this. They hate this term. They can't get behind it. And they're like, why would you use that language? Why don't you say we should, reorganize funding, or, and it's because that's what we mean, right? We mean defund the police. Like, I don't know how else to say it. And there's been successes shown with organizations and cities that have channeled money into mental health programs, or they've channeled money into social services. This happens not just with police outcomes, but even in schools. When you decrease police presence, when you take away metal detectors, when you give students a chance to meditate or do yoga instead of have this heavy police state in a school, you have better outcomes. I mean, this is just empirically proven. So I think that's the important part of it, is that the police are supposed to protect and serve. That is their job. It is not to punish. It is not to maim and beat and kill people. That is not the job of the police. So I don't understand. I mean, I do, because it's racism, but I don't really see any kind of value in the argument against defunding the police, because it's been empirically proven to work. And people who do not want to defund the police, it's because they benefit from that high police presence and it is not a threat to them. So I am all for channeling money into other forms of help for people who need it, rather than the police. And in the UK, I mean, most of our police, they don't have guns, right? Like they don't carry guns. They don't need it. Okay, so it's just not something that happens, and it's completely normal that police are not heavily armed. And we've had a lot of terror attacks here. And when there was terrorism, in the London Bridge attack recently, or Westminster's attacks, like, yeah, it's almost shocking when you see police that are armed, because we're not used to it. So I think as Americans, we're just very used to police having a lot of power, being able to break the law, getting away with breaking the law, not being prosecuted for laws. And I think we need to channel the funding somewhere else.
Gareth, what would you say in terms of increased funding for other professionals, such as mental health professionals?
Yes, I mean, I agree. I think interesting enough, the defund debate hasn't happened in South Africa. And I think it's largely because people are very scared because of the high levels of violence. And they still have this idea that the police, so even in poorer communities, and we did some research on COVID and policing in some high violent communities in the Western Cape during the initial lockdown. And there was very little change in people's attitudes around the police. They saw more police because there was this issue that we now had to have people in lockdown, couldn't be moving around. And so the police were largely deployed in larger numbers to poorer areas where people couldn't couldn't stay in their shacks, had to move around. So the police were in these areas. And funny enough, or interestingly enough, a lot of young people, because most of the survey was done over cell phones, and we got quite a high response rate, by over 5,000 responses from people under the age of 30, mostly in the early 20s, saying that they wanted to see this kind of policing after COVID, because they felt that if there were more police around, maybe that would make them feel safer than it does. Because as I was talking about routine brutality, it's not really that the police just go around beating up everybody. Most police, most of every day, are not beating up people. It's just that if you look at the patterns, it's usually at night, it's in very particular places, or it's against very specific kinds of interactions that are occurring. So most people in South Africa don't really actually have an engagement with the police. The survey data shows maybe 1/3 of adult South Africans will have some engagement with the police, mostly reporting a crime or trying to get something certified at a police station. So people generally have their attitudes are usually about policing in their area, formed by what people have told them, or how safe they feel, or whether they've been a victim of crime. So we haven't had that debate in South Africa, but we do a lot of work where we're looking at what are the kinds of interventions you can have in our communities aimed at protecting young children, very young children, I'm talking about under the age of 3, then from 2 to 7, and then teenagers, so that they're less likely to be violent when they grow up. And it doesn't involve policing, of course. We saw a massive increase in the numbers of police between the years 2002 and 2012. So the organization grew from 132,000 people to just about 200,000 people in 10 years. In that same period, the budget really went through the roof. But when we looked at for example, number of social workers that were needed to provide the services that were promised within existing government policy and legislation, we had a shortage of around 60,000 social workers. So all the money went into the police, not into social workers in that period. And now we're looking, and when we look at from 2012 to now, our murder rate has gone up by 37% in the last 8 years. So clearly having more police hasn't helped make us safer. Maybe if we had put that money into social workers and narrowed the focus of the police to only really dealing very specific dangerous situations. Because the idea of the police are supposed to be the legitimate use of state violence in order to enforce the law and ensure that the rules are applied equally. That would have been a much better outcome. That's something that we kind of would certainly have been trying to indicate. In South Africa, I think we're going to see is the funding happening across the board. So basically, there's a 12 to 15% budget cut across most departments. The police have taken really a 1 billion rand knock just in the last year. So we're going to, whether people like it or not, they're going to have to become more focused, more efficient. And as we keep on arguing in South Africa to police commanders and to the politicians who have this idea that the police must be tough, we're trying to make the point that if they're credible, they're far more likely to be able to play a role in improving public safety, because people work with them, see them as a resource, are more likely to make sure that those are committing serious violent crimes are reported, than if they don't trust the police, and then the police are not going to get support from the communities and have any impact. Yeah, so but interesting enough, we haven't had that defunded debate in South Africa.
So earlier this month, we were lucky enough to hear Professor Angela Davis speak as one of our distinguished lecturers. And during her talk, she argued, and this was speaking specifically about the US, she argued that imprisonment and policing are profound impediments to our democratic futures. So she also stated that it is not possible to remove the racism without the entire system collapsing. So quite a strong statement coming from her, and definitely food for thought. Adrienne, what would you say in response to this?
I mean, I support anything Angela Davis says. Yes, so that's my response. But I mean, if we look to feminism, we look to radical feminism, it's the same thing, right? And you can look to even Black feminism, or the idea that you can't disassemble the master's house by using the master's tools, right? So it's the idea that every one of our systems in the US and in the UK, we can talk about colonialism if we wanted to come to the UK context, but in the US, every one of our systems is based on a patriarchy. Every one of our systems is based on white supremacy. That's how our judicial system works. That's how our government works. That's how our media works. That's how our school system works. And yeah, it's really difficult to dismantle racism when that's the way the system was built, is to benefit white people and to disadvantage minoritized people.
Yes, same question for you, Gareth. I mean, how do we kind of envision moving forward without dismantling it all and starting again?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question, and you know, as I showed, here we are 27 years after apartheid, and literally the structural inequality, the ability to get a job, to get education, to be healthy, to live in a good life that you should be able to fulfill your abilities and dreams, is still completely racialized, and that's despite what would in some ways see a big radical shift in political power. But it hasn't changed the economic system. It hasn't changed the way that we ensure that the economy is equally distributed or better distributed. That we don't actually focus on making the lives of the most vulnerable people better. Although our policies are there, I mean, if you read most South African laws and policies, look great on paper. They're fantastic, but when it comes down to actually implementation, it's not leading to any change. And then, of course, in South Africa, we also have, but it's led to a kind of a political idea. So there's a kind of faction within the governing party they call themselves Radical Economic Transformation. Now, unfortunately, most of them are facing allegations or in fact criminal charges for corruption. And they've used this idea to try and deflect the attention away from their wrongdoing and say, no, well, actually, we're being targeted because we are going against white monopoly capital. And so in many ways, we're not having the kind of debates we need to have. People are not able to kind of understand what is going on there. But I do think that in South Africa, there is really a big need for quite structural economic reform. And that's growing, that recognition is growing, but no one can actually agree on what that looks like or how that will look. And I think it's always, again, once it's not only about race, but it's about wealth and class. And as long as sort of people with wealth are benefiting from the system, and have the power to keep the system in place, whether they're black or white, they're unlikely to want to do anything too radical. You know, so we have massive social grants system in South Africa, but it keeps people poor. It's not actually helping people get out of poverty. It might might alleviate some of the absolute worst effects if you didn't have it, but it's not really going to change anything. So I don't actually know what the answer is, but it's certainly something that we should all be striving towards and thinking about as much as possible.
I think you've both emphasized that we need to view these issues through a systemic lens. And, if we are thinking about solutions and if we are thinking about moving forward, could you maybe take us through what solutions look like at different levels of society? If we are viewing these problems systemically, what could solutions look like, starting at more of a grassroots level and then moving up through organizational levels and to the political levels? What could solutions start looking like? Gareth, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I think in South Africa, we would have to take a long-term view, of course. We'd have to say, what do we want the country to look like in 10 years? And that would really, starting off would be a focus on making sure that children are growing up in safe spaces. A lot of our work that we do on what we call violence prevention is really just about helping caregivers develop warm, loving, consistent bonds with the children that they're looking after. And already we've managed to do this in some high violence communities. And over the last 3 years, we've been able to start changing attitudes and behaviors. So a reduction in use of corporal punishment, for example, people starting to read to their children. So those kinds of interventions where there's some evidence that if you improve that at a community level, your children will be more resilient, they're more likely to pay attention in school, they're more likely to stay in school. As you know, from being in South Africa, we have a massive dropout rate. About 500,000 people, children, drop out of school from the moment they start to the moment they won't reach matric. And people out of matric are much more likely to be poor and unemployed. So I would really say if you're having limited resources, it would be to kind of reduce the focus of the criminal justice system. Don't be going around locking people up. In fact, there's been a study that shows that our police probably, as an organization, abuse people's rights more than any other organization in South Africa. So that should stop immediately, because if the state authority is a contributing factor to violence, then, and unfortunately we don't see it that way. We somehow still want more police, but in fact the police are part of the problem. They are also violent. They're also traumatized by violence. And I mean, I feel like I'm bashing the police. We have many excellent police officers who do understand this, who are actually themselves trying to work with us in various communities, because they recognize that the solution is not just about policing. The solution is about working with children. So I would really, start there. And I think if we can really get better health outcomes for our children, they'll have better life chances. And that's probably the way we focus our resources if we're going forward.
Absolutely. Adrienne, to you, the same question.
Yeah, I mean, I have a very macro level of approach of enact the policy first and get people's minds changed later. I feel that, a ground up approach, while it's nice, if you think about racial attitudes specifically, things like implicit bias training, they don't work at all. It's a nice idea. People want to better themselves, people want to educate themselves, but that does not change outcomes. So if you think back to Brown versus Board of Education, people were, up in arms against desegregation, white people specifically, and you can look at the pictures of desegregation happening and how, livid people were. And, now we would all look back and say, of course we shouldn't have segregated schools. Of course not. And that's because we were raised in desegregation. And so I think you make the policy and then people change their attitudes. So we have some interesting work with desegregation in sex in terms of sports. And students in the US who go to schools where they can play mixed gender sports, they're more likely to agree with policy that mixed gender sports should exist, because that's just how it is. And so I don't feel like we can trust people to do the right thing. I don't, and again, in the UK, if I said we should have affirmative action policy, that would be incredibly controversial, right? Like, incredibly controversial, because people aren't even thinking about things in a systemic way over here. But I really think that's the way to make large scale change, is to enact the policy that is progressive, that works, that's empirically proven to be successful, and let people change their minds over time. I don't really, and maybe I'm being really negative on a Friday afternoon over here, but I don't trust the majority of white Americans, as evidenced by that racism profile that I showed before.
Thanks. I'll end with this question for both of you. If you know, or if there are any successful examples of cities, countries, or systems where policing has been done better, where we've seen better examples of policing, where it hasn't just been this focus on punishment, locking people up, brutality, unlawful arrests. If there are any examples, or anything that we should be striving towards.
I mean, I think it's not just policing, but the entire criminal justice system that kind of Gareth mentioned as well. It's in the US specifically, it's not just our policing, but our prison system. And there's been a lot of more effective prison systems that focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment. And the goal of the adult criminal justice system is punishment. And that, again, is not effective because our recidivism rate is so high in the US. So I think it's not just looking at policing, but in the entire criminal justice system. And again, there's plenty of examples, especially from Europe, in terms of people actually changing in prison rather than getting worse in terms of becoming just a better criminal, which is how it exists now. But certain cities have taken funds away from the police and have initial success. I mean, these things have just happened relatively soon, so I'd be careful to say we should all change our police system to look like Los Angeles or whatever it is. But I think we can see, over the next year where those changes have been made and definitely adapted in other cities.
Yeah, I think looking at police reform internationally, it's difficult to identify great examples. I mean, there's been a few. There was that, I think it was Georgia, that country that basically dismissed half their police service and then asked everybody to reapply, and radically changed the numbers and structure of the police agency, and they had great outcomes. By doing that, they seem to have managed to reduce levels of police brutality, grown levels of police legitimacy and credibility. So, I'd say that sort of, in many ways, I mean, there are also examples in Europe. I mean, it depends on what angle you look at. Because some people say, well, all policing by its very nature is going to be coercive. It's based on the use of force or the threat of state force. It's always going to replicate the unequal power structures in every society. So it would be good if there was a society to see how do you get out of that. In many ways, across Africa, most people live without policing. The police are actually not public police, they're state police. In other words, they're there to protect the power structures in place, but they don't have the funding to have reach, so they tend to sometimes only really exist in any meaningful way in the cities or very urbanized areas. And most people solve problems in more traditional ways. They rely on traditional leaders, they have traditional courts, they have to, because they don't have that state presence. And I mean, I think that's something that should be given a lot of thought to, that we need to rethink our idea of what the police should be. So I would certainly be moving towards, if I was thinking about South Africa, I would say that there would be no political appetite to suddenly change the police. As I said, people still think they need the police, but certainly really limit their scope. I mean, basically not see them as somebody you call unless you really are in a severe emergency situation. And then they are trained to go in there and make sure that they keep people safe and that they hold people's rights, and that they're trained to treat suspects and victims the same, because that they are being driven by an idea of legitimacy and public credibility. And I think that would be a radical change in South Africa. But unfortunately, we've still got a society that is traumatized by violence, and interestingly enough, then believes that violence is not only sometimes legitimate, but necessary. So lots of South African families, about 60%, still use corporal punishment on their children. Although it's completely outlawed. So just to go, I mean, Adrienne part saying that we should have the policies in countries with weak governments. You can have great policies, but if there's no will or ability to implement them, then things don't change. That's why I sort of wasn't coming from a policy point of view and just saying, if we get enough children growing up to just be able to have a life in which they can be critical about the systems they're in and imagine a different system, and then actively work towards that, challenge the system, be different, And I mean, that would be having the kinds of programs you're talking about, gender mixed sport. There's been great programs done in different parts of Africa, Uganda. I can think of one where and Kenya, where they've dramatically changed young boys' attitudes to girls in 6 weeks with girls, and then track these kids over a period of time as they become teenagers and seen dramatically reduced levels of domestic violence and that kind of thing. So I still think, you know, ultimately in countries with weak states, you've got to try and capacitate the youth, to be the new future that we hope will be a fairer and better place. I don't know if that's a great answer, but that's what I think I would recommend.
Thank you so much to both of you. I mean, these are incredibly complex questions, and I think our aim today was really to create awareness and give the audience food for thought, and to really look at the global perspective, and you know what we can learn from countries such as South Africa, from the UK, and how that can be applied. So I'd like to just thank both of you once again for attending this morning and sharing your incredible insights with us. And I would like to hand over to Lawrence and Rogelio just to end the session today.
Great, thanks a lot. Yeah, this was a terrific session. I really appreciate our two international experts, Gareth Newham and Adrienne Milner. And I also want to say a word of thanks to Christian Samuel, who did an outstanding job as a moderator. And we hasten to add that he's a Fulbright scholar here at the University of Arkansas studying community health. He comes to us with a master's in global health and policy from the UK. And he's a Fulbrighter from South Africa. And he, of course, as you can tell from the quality of his questions, he knows a thing or two about these issues too. He's very interested in his own research on health outcomes and the intersections with race and sexuality and gender. So thank you all on behalf of the Arkansas Global Changemakers Program. We're delighted that you were all able to join us today. We were really glad to see so many Fulbrighters in the audience today. We were even joined by Dee Dee Long, the president of the Fulbright Association. And I've put a link in the chat for everyone to the Global Changemakers website so that you can follow along with the upcoming events. We have a book club, we have the Fulbright Scholars Social Impact Series, and then we do on-campus programming, study abroad, and a range of other events. Rogelio, any closing comments?
No, just thank our speakers today and our two Fulbright Scholars leaders that made this event possible. Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you, Olga, a social entrepreneur at heart who actually came up with this wonderful idea. And thank you to Adrienne and Garrett for wonderful, insightful conversation. And Garrett, I have to say that as a soccer fan, all I hear is that it is imperative to organize a FIFA World Cup every year. I mean, aside from being a great opportunity to watch the greatest players of the world play the beautiful game, we need to consider the tremendous positive impact World Cups have on public safety. So thank you for that, for that input.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the discussion and the questions.
Thank you, Adrienne.
Thank you. We hope you all have a good weekend. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, everybody.